Oh my gosh. A guten Erev Shabbos, my holy sisters and brothers. How's everybody doing? It's a Friday afternoon. We're getting ready for Shabbos. So excited to be back from my travels and back with you. Let's light up the darkness. Wow, Facebook is making it really difficult. It's unbelievable. It's just not getting out there to the normal numbers. We've really seen a lot of this lately. Sort of faith-related pages, Judaism-related pages, having trouble breaking through the noise. So thank God that you're here. It's wonderful if you put in the comments, anything, hello, how you doing? But just adding text into the comments signals to Facebook that something important is going on here, and then more people will get a chance to see it because it will show up in their feeds. Today's show is dedicated to Rabbi Shlomo Carlebach of blessed memory. Today is his yahrzeit. That was Shlomo Carlebach singing during the opening 2 minutes. Beautiful song, beautiful story. He used to do a lot of traveling in the old Soviet Union. And under communist rule, very, very difficult to be an observant Jew. Almost like the Roman oppression during Talmudic times in the land of Israel. And on one of those visits, he happened to be in Moscow during Simchas Torah, and tried to bring some joy and cheer and Yiddishkeit and uplifting Torah and Jewish music to the Jews, under the Soviet thumb, as it were, in Moscow. And he noticed this young woman who had come but was sort of hanging in the back, left early, and then he saw her again outside and had a chance to speak with her. And she said, my father is a diehard communist, and he would not allow me to have any contact with Jews. Not just Judaism, but with Jews. This is her Jewish father. Can you imagine growing up in such a way? But she just felt the stirring in her heart as a Jewish woman to connect with God. And, sneaking not only around the Soviet authorities, but even her father managed to find some Jews, connect with them, just had no Jewish education whatsoever. And just asked an old man coming out of a Jewish prayer meeting at some point, someday I want to connect. Can you give me something to keep me going? And he taught her Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. And Aleph, Beis, Gimel, Daled, Hey, the first 5 letters of the alphabet. That's all she knew. She couldn't light candles on Fridays, given her circumstance and living in her father's house. But she would sit by the window on Friday evenings, and when she could see 3 stars in the sky, she would recite these lines, the only ones she knew. Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Daled, Hey. And Rabbi Carlebach, before singing this song, tells this story, and he said that even the most learned and most pious rabbi in the world, is not going to have his Torah and his words and his prayers heard in heaven with the same, sweetness as the words of this young woman who's longing with her heart to connect. How fortunate are we that we live in a time and place when we are free to learn the tradition of our ancestors, to connect with God according to that tradition, to express ourselves as Jews or people of faith in the world in which we live in today. Lots of challenges in this world, but we must never take that freedom for granted. How's everybody doing? Who's with us as we get together to do some learning on a Friday afternoon? Yehudit Sobel says Shabbat Shalom, Nina Sal, and everyone from Florence, South Carolina, wishing all a restful and rejuvenating Shabbos. Gordo with us from Scotland. Great to have you here, Gordo. Nancy in North Carolina. Patrice saying Shabbat Shalom from California. Patrice, aren't you often in Utah? Am I remembering that correctly? Where am I? Stephen in New Hampshire. Hannah Leslie in Texas. Randy in Florida. Lucy in Minnesota. Franco Zanini saying Shalom from Trieste in Italy. Ciao de Franco. Great to have you with us today. And over there on the YouTube side, Lynn in North Texas and Marjorie. I'm pretty sure you're in Georgia, right, Marjorie? And we're in the midst of a battle between the LA Dodgers and the Atlanta Braves, and may the best team win. All right. Where am I? Okay, so we have a lot to cover today. I was away visiting my parents. As I mentioned, my mom has dementia, quite advanced. And my brother and I were down there together. My father visits her every day. My brother lives in Boston. I live here. We don't get that chance so often, but we got to spend some quality time with my mom every day. It's really advanced. I mean, she barely opens her eyes. It's hard to say if she recognized us those few moments when she did open her eyes. She seemed to be having some kind of emotion, and I think she did recognize us at some level. But it's not even how it used to be a year ago. And, she's been in that memory care facility now for 7 years. And it's very, very difficult watching somebody, go down that road of dementia and then advanced dementia. But let us have faith that this terrible and inexplicable disease has a purpose in God's world. And we don't know what it is, but it must have some kind of a purpose. And perhaps the people who are going through that journey internally somewhere, their soul is being given a chance, some kind of long time out where the soul is still with the body but not interacting with this world. And perhaps that allows them to work out or to do some kind of holy work that they could not do otherwise. That is what I choose to believe. Okay, so we've got a lot of pages to cover. We are in Tractate Rosh Hashana, the 9th volume of the Talmud. We're in chapter 1 and still discussing the first Mishna, in which the sages discuss that there are at least 4 New Years that commemorate different matters on different dates. So the new year that we're used to, Rosh Hashana, and this is Tractate Rosh Hashana, occurs on the 1st of Tishrei in the fall when the calendar year turns over. But as we've discussed, the 1st of Nisan is the new year for kings and for certain other matters. And now we're going to learn a bunch of other matters and where their new year falls. Today we'll be discussing pages 8 through 13. So 6 pages we're going to cover. We're obviously not doing the whole page. We almost never do the whole page, but now that we're doing 6 pages in one day, we're going to be doing some beautiful highlights from these 6 pages that were the schedule during the past week. So buckle your seatbelts. It's going to be an exciting ride. We pick it up on the A side of page 8. The Mishnah teaches that Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon say the new year for animal tithes, right? So many people were shepherds. They were raising animals. Among the firstborns in the herd, the new births in the herd every year, one has to put aside 10%. That's a tithe means a tenth, and they're going to be put aside, consecrated for holy purpose. So why do you need a date on the calendar? Because after that date, right, anything born between that date and that same date in the following year is going to be the number of sheep or goats or whatever the animal that's born in that year, and 1/10 have to be set aside as the tithe. So that's why you need a date for this. There we go. Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon say the new year for animal tithes is on the 1st of Tishrei, so the standard Rosh Hashana that we're familiar with. Rabbi Yochanan said, and both of them, Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Meir, expounded the same verse in different ways. Now, what are we talking about, this animal tithe? Before we get to why they picked the date of the 1st of Tishrei, what is the source for the animal tithe? That's Deuteronomy 14, 22, and 23. You shall tithe a tithe from all the increase of your seed that the field brings forth year by year. And you shall eat before the Lord your God in the place which he shall choose to place his name there, the tithe of your grain, of your wine, of your oil, and the firstborn of your herds and your flocks, that you may learn to fear the Lord your God always. So there's a different kind of a tithe here in terms of the Bechor, the firstborn male of a female, and just setting aside the tithe year by year. Now, so Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yochanan says that Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Elazar agree, and they expounded the same verse in different. That Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Elazar expounded the same verse in different ways. As it is stated, this is Psalms 65:14. The flocks are clothed in the meadows, and the valleys are wrapped in grain. They shout for joy. They also sing. So from this verse from Psalm 65, Rabbi Meir holds, when are the flocks clothed in the meadows, i.e., when do the rams impregnate the ewes and thereby clothe them? It is at the time when the valleys are wrapped in grain. In other words, when they are covered in grain. And when are the valleys wrapped in grain? It is in Adar. That's the springtime month that contains Purim. That's the month before Nisan, the month that contains Passover. Therefore, the sheep conceive in Adar, and they give birth 5 months later in the summer month of Av. And so it is fitting that their new year is on the 1st of Elul, as most of the year's lambs have been born by them. So according to Rabbi Meir, the new year for the tithes ought to be the first day of Elul. Elul is the last month of the calendar year, the month before Tishrei, which begins with Rosh Hashana. Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon say, when are the flocks clothed in the meadows? At the time that the stalks of grain shout for joy and also sing. When do the stalks break out in song? I.e., when are they full so that they rustle in the wind and create the whispering sounds of song? I mean, do you not love this image, my pals? Right? That imagine grain, wheat, fields of wheat, particularly in Israel, which doesn't have so much flat plains, but there's always a little bit of contour in the land. Right, so you have a little bit of gentle upslopes and downslopes, and even the foothills of the mountains, the Judean mountains. And when they're covered in wheat and the wind blows the wheat, so it's not just a rustling, it's not just a beautiful natural sound, it is one of the songs of nature. It's a song of the land and the fecundity of the land, the wheat and grain, and all that food bursting forth in song of praise to the Lord. It's just a beautiful, beautiful image. And so when do the stalks break out in song? I.e., when are they full so that they rustle in the wind and create the whispering sounds of song? It is in Nisan, the springtime month that contains Passover. Therefore, the sheep conceive in Nisan and give birth in Elul, and so it is fitting that their new year is on the 1st of Tishrei. And in fact, Tishrei is when we have the new year for the animal tithe. we skip down a bit near the bottom of page 8a. And if you wish, say that Rav Chisda teaches the Mishnah, as did Rabbi Zera, and he maintains that when it says the first of Tishrei is the new year for years. Okay, so I'm sorry. Now we're on a new subject. That Rosh Hashana is the new year for counting years, right? So this is where we get the idea that Rosh Hashana is the head of the calendar year. And that's why this is the Hebrew year 5782. When did it cease to be 5781 and it became 5782? On Rosh Hashana, the first day of Tishrei. So Rav Chisda teaches the Mishnah, as did Rabbi Zera, and he maintains that when it says that the first of Tishrei is the new year for years, it is not referring to documents, as Rabbi Zera said. The first of Tishrei is the new year for years with regard to calculating the cycles of the sun and the moon. So what they're arguing about, we already had this idea that the first of Nisan is the new year for kings. That's when you count that another year has been added to the number of years of the reign of a Jewish king, when there is a Jewish king over the kingdom of Israel. But that the new year for foreign kings is the first day of Tishrei. And why was that relevant? Because legal documents in ancient times always said, and I'm selling you this property on the first day of Adar in the 27th year of the reign of King Solomon, for example. But you would also put just the calendar year, right? And in the first day of Adar in 3780, right? And so one of the reasons that the calendar years matter is for legal documents. So that's one explanation why it matters. But now we're getting a different reason why calendar years turn over on the first day of Tishrei. And so Rabbi Zera said the first of Tishrei is the new year for counting years, with regard to calculating the cycles of the sun and the moon. And this is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, who said the world was created in the month of Tishrei. And all the calculations with regard to the sun and the moon are based on when they were created. And Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak said, when the Mishnah says that the first of Tishrei is the new year for years, it is with regard to judgment, as on that day God judges the world for the whole year. So now we're getting into another rationale and another, sort of analysis of the new year being Rosh Hashana, the first of Tishrei, as a day of judgment. So we'll get into that in one moment. But when Rabbi Zera says that the first of Tishrei is when we count years with respect to the cycles of the sun and the moon, so what he's alluding to is, we've already mentioned this before, is that the Hebrew calendar is based on a lunar year. Each month is 29 or 30 days based on the cycles of the moon. 12 months adds up to 353, 54, or 55 days. That's going to get way out of sync pretty quickly from the solar year, which is 365 days. And so that's why we add that leap month in 7 out of every 19 years. And so to reconcile the solar year with the lunar year is why we need these cycles of sun and moon and to be aware of them. And that's all based on Rosh Hashana on the first of Tishrei. But we could have used some other date in the calendar, and that's why Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak says that the first of Tishrei is the new year for years, the new year for counting years. Why? Because it is with regard to judgment. Recall that in the Torah, the first of Tishrei is mentioned as an important festival. It's not called the head of the year because the Torah refers to Tishrei as the 7th month, counting from Nisan, the month in which we came out of Egypt. So why would the new year and the new calendar year begin in what is the Torah calls the 7th month? Now we're learning because the Torah does refer to the first of Tishrei as the day of judgment, as the day of sounding the shofar. It is the day of blasting the shofar. And now Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak is talking about this. He says, it is the new year for years with regard to judgment. As on that day, God judges the world for the whole year. Right? So when God passes judgment, he's passing judgment on all the inhabitants of the world And what is the judgment? What is going to happen to all of them in the coming year, right? So God doesn't make a ruling on your whole future, what's going to happen to you for the rest of your life, because we're allowed to have free will. God may predict what we're going to do, but we can change our outcome depending on how we behave. However, on Rosh Hashana, it's going to be written, and on Yom Kippur, it's going to be sealed, and, up until Hoshana Rabbah, we can sort of get a little bit of a change and amelioration in the judgment. But during that period that we just went through, the high holidays, Rosh Hashana, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, Hoshana Rabbah, etc., that's when God passes judgment for every human being, what's going to happen to them in the coming year. So God judges the world for the whole year. As it is written, Deuteronomy 11:12, a land that the Lord your God cares for, the eyes of the Lord your God are always upon it from the beginning of the year until the end of the year. From the beginning of the year, judgment is passed as to what will happen at the end of the year. And the Gemara raises a question: from where is it known that the day of judgment is in Tishrei? As it is written, blow a shofar at the new moon, at the covered time for our festival day. That's Psalm 81:4. Now, which is the festival day on which the moon is covered? Rosh Hashana is a festival. It's a Yom Tov. It has the same laws with respect to not doing work, but that you are allowed to cook, just like Passover, Shavuos, and Sukkot. These are all Chagim. They're all a Yom Tov, right? That's a festival. But unlike Passover, Shavuos, and Sukkot, the moon is a new moon on Rosh Hashanah. Passover and Sukkot, it's a full moon because they're on the 15th day of a lunar month. Shavuos is on the 6th, so the moon is increasing, but it's definitely visible. Rosh Hashanah is on the first day, not only of the year, but of the lunar month of Tishrei, and all Hebrew months begin with a new moon, right? When there is no moon, or when the moon is not visible, it's not lit by the sun. So the only festival day in which the moon is covered is Rosh Hashanah, and since this line from Psalm says, blow a shofar on the new moon at the covered time for our festival day on which the moon is covered, you must say that this is Rosh Hashanah, which is the only festival that occurs at the beginning of a month when the moon cannot be seen. And it is written in the next verse, Psalm 81:15, for this is a statute for Israel, a judgment of the God of Jacob, implying that Rosh Hashanah is not just a day of blowing the shofar, but also a day of judgment. With regard to this same verse, the sages taught in a Baraisa, for this is a statute for Israel, a judgment of the God of Jacob. This teaches that the heavenly court does not assemble for judgment until the earthly court has sanctified the month, once the Sanhedrin has declared that the day as Rosh Hashanah. Isn't that amazing? If Rosh Hashanah is a day on which God is going to judge all the people for the coming year, you would think that that day is determined, when does a when does a defendant in a criminal trial come before the court for judgment? When the court says, you show up on this day and we will judge you. The court decides what day is the day of judgment. But since Rosh Hashanah is based on the Hebrew calendar, and the calendar is originally conceived, right? It was, and we've talked about it many times, that witnesses would come before the Sanhedrin to testify they had seen the new moon, and then the Sanhedrin would say, okay, this is the new month. It's the Sanhedrin, the earthly court, that decides when the new year, when the new month, and if it's Tishrei, therefore the new year has begun. And so we see that the earthly court convenes the day of judgment, as it were, by picking that day to be the new year. And then the heavenly court says, okay, and now we're going to judge the world, right? And then God sits in judgment on the whole world after the earthly court has called the court in session. Now, as taught in another Baraisa, the verse states, for this is a statute for Israel. From here I have derived only that this is the day of judgment for the Jewish people. From where do I derive that it is also the day of judgment for all the nations of the world, all the Gentile nations of the world. Therefore, the verse states a judgment for the God of Jacob, who rules over the entire world. If so, what is the meaning when the verse states a statute for Israel? This teaches that the Jewish people enter for judgment first. Is that an advantage or a disadvantage to come before the court for judgment first? Maybe it's sort of like the Israeli army, right? That the leaders, the military leaders, lead from in front, not from behind. And so, okay, if the whole world is going to pass before judgment of the God of Jacob, okay, well then the children of Jacob, and Jacob is Israel, so the children of Israel are going to be judged first. Whether that helps us or not, up to debate. But the point here is everyone in the world is judged on that day. Now you might say, well, wait a minute. If only the Jews know it's Rosh Hashanah, no one else cares. But everyone in the world is being judged. Wouldn't it be good to get this information out there so that people could, at least believing people, could pray for forgiveness, amelioration of the judgment, saying thanks to God for everything that's come before. I'm sorry for all the things I did wrong, etc. What can I say? At least we have accidental Talmudists and our community. I don't mean AT as me, but AT as our community, getting this information out there. And, so many of the people who are part of our community are not Jewish. So, I'm not the first, obviously, to get this out there, but it's well worth knowing and sharing with your friends that Rosh Hashanah is a day of judgment for all peoples. We skip down a little bit. We are on the B side of page 8. The Mishna teaches the first of Tishrei is also the new year for Jubilee years. The verse from the Torah about the Jubilee is on the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia, right? Proclaim liberty throughout the land. This refers to the Jubilee year. We've talked about the Shemitah cycle, that every 7 years, when the kingdom of Israel was, ancient Israel living, as a kingdom of God, as it were, ruled by Torah law, not secular law. And even now we have Shemitah cycles, but then it was like no farmers were planting their fields every 7th year, trusting that God had given them a superabundance in the 6th year that would see them through until they could plant again in the new cycle, the 8th year, as it were. 7 of these 7-year cycles, 49 years, and then the next year was the Jubilee year, when again they wouldn't plant crops, right? So after 49 years, or after 48 years, there would be a 2-year hiatus of leaving all the fields unplanted, right? And then God would give a superabundance in that 48th year so that the people would not go hungry and there would be plenty for everyone to eat, even though the fields wouldn't be planted for 2 years. In addition to this agricultural rule, the slaves were all freed. Debts were forgiven, and land that had been sold would revert to the ancestral holding, right? Because it was a forever thing when the land of Israel was partitioned among the 12 tribes that Joshua led into the land of Israel. Those were the ancestral holdings that they would always belong to those tribes as they were distributed. And if somebody became impoverished and sold their field, they were only selling it for the number of years remaining in this cycle of the Yovel or Jubilee in English. So the Mishnah teaches the first of Tishrei is also the new year for Jubilee years. The Gemara asks, is the new year for Jubilee years on the first of Tishrei? Isn't the new year for Jubilee years on the 10th of Tishrei, meaning Yom Kippur? Because when they would sound the shofar to announce that this is the Jubilee year, they would do that on Yom Kippur. As it is written, Leviticus 25, verses 9 and 10, then shall you cause the shofar to sound on the 10th day of the 7th month. On Yom Kippur shall you sound the shofar throughout all your land. And you shall hallow the 50th year and proclaim liberty throughout all the land, the line from the Liberty Bell. To all its inhabitants, it shall be a Jubilee year for you. And the Gemara answers, in accordance with whose opinion is this Mishnah? It is the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael, son of Rabbi Yochanan Beroka, as it is taught in a Baraisa. What is the meaning when the verse states, and you shall hallow the 50th year? Since it is stated that the shofar is blown on Yom Kippur, one might have thought that the year is sanctified only from Yom Kippur and onward. Therefore, the verse states, and you shall hallow the 50th year, the whole year, which teaches that the year is sanctified from its beginning to its end, from the first of Tishrei, when the year begins. From here, Rabbi Yishmael, son of Rabbi Yochanan Baraka, said, from Rosh Hashana until Yom Kippur of the Jubilee year, the 50th year in the cycle, Hebrew slaves were not released to their homes because the shofar had not yet been sounded on Yom Kippur to announce the Jubilee, and they were also not enslaved to their masters, as the Jubilee year had already begun. Rather, they would eat, drink, and rejoice, and they would wear their crowns on their heads like free people. Once Yom Kippur arrived, the court would sound the shofar, and the slaves would be released to their houses, and fields that were sold would be returned to their original owners. Now, who are these slaves that we're talking about? There are various ways that a person could become a slave, and there was a big difference for the Jewish people between Jewish slaves and non-Jewish slaves. So one kind of slavery, a typical slave situation is somebody that becomes so indebted they couldn't pay their debts. And so, they were remanded to become slaves until they could pay their debts. But a Jewish slave could only be a slave for 6 years, and then he would go free, and he would not go empty-handed. Although at that time, if he wanted to, if the slave chose, he could remain a slave because he felt like his situation was better. When you cannot compare the slavery of ancient times to the slavery of in America before 1865, really 1863. Slavery is terrible no matter how and when. I'm not saying slavery is ever good, but it was a different kind of setup. And when the Torah was given into the world, it completely and radically changed the situation of slaves compared to before, where slaves, sort of pre-Torah slavery in the ancient world was like the slavery in the South. People are property and just horribly abused. After the Torah was given, at least for the people following the Torah, slaves had certain rights, and you couldn't, abuse slaves in the same way. And here we're learning about the Jubilee year. If that comes along, then all the slaves go free. Certain exceptions to that. The Canaanite people were considered, these are the people practicing child sacrifice, all kinds of other abominations. If they were enslaved, through the war, then they would not go free in the Jubilee year. But at any rate, slavery is not something that has been practiced or condoned within, Jewish context in thousands of years. Enough to say about that. All right, we are on the A side of page 9, having skipped forward. From here, I have derived only that the extension is added to Yom Kippur. So we've been talking about Yom Kippur in the context of the Jubilee year, and now we're skipping forward, and we find ourselves in a bit of a discussion about the fact that Yom Kippur, when we observe Yom Kippur, and we have the fast of Yom Kippur, because the Torah says you shall afflict yourselves on Yom Kippur, it's not a 24-hour fast, right? Days are 24 hours long, but this fast is 25 hours long, mostly because we're not sure about that twilight period. Has the old day ended and the new day begun? To be sure that we are fasting throughout the 10th of Tishrei, we start, at the beginning of the twilight period as we enter Yom Kippur, and the fast ends at the end of the twilight period as we leave Yom Kippur, and that's why it's approximately 25 hours. Why do we add this time, and how do we add it? So from here, I have derived only that the extension is added to Yom Kippur. From where is it derived? So the rabbis derived that we have to add this time to make sure that we cover Yom Kippur and that the fast is appropriately observed. How do we know that we do the same for Shabbos? Right? The candle lighting is at the beginning of the twilight period, and Havdalah is at the end of the twilight period. So Shabbos is also observed for 25 hours, not for fasting, but for resting and rejoicing. So from where is it derived that one must also extend Shabbos? And the verse states, you shall rest, Tishbatu, which is referring to Yom Kippur, but also alludes to Shabbos. From where do I know that the same applies to festivals? That the rest of festivals, the rest and rejoicing of festivals is also like 25 hours because we enter in the beginning of twilight and leave at the end of twilight. How do we know that we do that for festivals? The verse states, your Shabbat, your Shabbatchem, your day of rest. How so? Your day of rest. How so? Wherever there is a mitzvah of resting, be it Shabbos or a festival, one adds from the mundane to the sacred, extending the sacred time at both ends. Skipping a little more, we're on the B side of page 9. Continuing the topic of the Jubilee year, the sages taught in a baraisa, the verse states, and you shall hallow the 50th year and proclaim liberty throughout all the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you. The words, it shall be a jubilee, come to teach that although they did not release property to its original owners, like a field that was sold and needs to be returned, and although they did not sound the shofar, it is nevertheless a Jubilee year, and the laws of the Jubilee year apply. As I mentioned, the Jubilee year, the law of the Jubilee has implications for the farmers that they cannot plant. And in property law, in the law of slaves, in the laws of selling fields, in the law of debts, etc., also has implications. So what if there were no slaves to free? What if slavery had been, completely abolished and there were no slaves to free? So no slaves were freed. Does that mean that, then it's not really a Jubilee year and so we can plant the fields? That's a question they're asking. And so according to this opinion, the sages taught, it shall be a jubilee. It comes to teach that even if they didn't release fields, property to the original owners, and even if they didn't sound the shofar, that's the law. You have to sound the shofar and proclaim that this is a jubilee year. Nevertheless, the laws of the jubilee do apply. Now, one might have thought that although they did not send free the slaves, it is also still a jubilee year. Therefore, the verse states, it shall be, this being a term of limitation. This teaches that at least one of the essential halachas of the year must be observed, and if not, then it is not a Jubilee year. So let's see where the law came out on this. What is the actual halacha at the end of this debate? In the Jubilee year, if the shofar was not sounded, the slaves were not emancipated, or the fields were not released and returned to their original owners, then it is not considered the Jubilee year for other matters, i.e., for example, the prohibition against working the land and the obligation to cancel monetary debts, right? So you don't have to do all of them. You don't have to sound the shofar and release slaves and return fields to their original owners. But if you don't do any of them, if the court doesn't declare that at least one of those things has to happen, then it's not a Jubilee year with respect to agriculture and canceling debts. And this ruling is in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis. Also, the Jubilee year inside the land of Israel and outside the land of Israel. If the mitzvah, the commandment of the Jubilee year, is not kept in the land of Israel, and especially if ancestral lands are not released there to their original owners, then the laws of the Jubilee year that normally apply outside of Israel are not in force, right? So the idea of the Jubilee year is not just, hey, let's have a party, let's have a celebration. If we're not doing at least one of these essential laws of the Jubilee year, then it's not a Jubilee year. Do we celebrate the Jubilee year today in contemporary times? No, we do not. Do we observe the Shemitah cycle? Yes, we do. We know which years are the Shemitah cycle, the 7th year. And there's actually all kinds of organizations that sort of raise funds so that sort of observant Jewish farmers in the land of Israel can afford not to plant their fields, and they sort of get subsidized for not planting for religious purposes. It's not from the government of Israel, I can assure you, but there are organizations that sort of subsidize these farmers so that we can practice the Shemitah. But the Yovel, the Jubilee, I mean, there's no slaves in the world to free. We could sound the shofar and proclaim it, but since the destruction of the Second Temple, since the disbanding of the Sanhedrin, so that a court would declare that it's the Jubilee, we don't have that Sanhedrin anymore, and we don't have the Jubilee year. And we look forward to the day when Moshiach, the Messiah, comes and restores the land of Israel to the Jewish people in a Torah context. And then the Jubilee will be observed again as it was in ancient times, but we don't observe it now. On the B side of page 9, the Mishna teaches, and the first of Tishrei is the new year for planting. It determines the years of Orla, the 3-year period from when a tree has been planted, during which time its fruit is forbidden. When you plant a new fruit tree, and even if you graft, you take an existing tree and plant that, for its first 3 years, you cannot eat its fruit. In the 4th year, those fruits are consecrated. They have to be taken to Jerusalem. And then from the 5th year on, the owner of the orchard or the fruit tree, as it were, is free to eat and sell and trade with those fruits. So that's the prohibition of Orla. You can't eat it during its first 3 years. From when do you count those years? The first of Tishrei, right? So even if a tree is planted on the 30th day of Elul, or then they're going to discuss that, well, wait a minute, when does it germinate? But for sure, if you plant the tree, in Av, the penultimate month of the year, comes Rosh Hashana, the first of Tishrei. It's only been in the ground, for a little over a month, let's say, but that's considered to be a 1-year-old tree, and now we enter its 2nd year. So that's why the first of Tishrei is the new year with respect to fruit trees. We skip down on the B side of page 10. Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Elazar hold that the world was created in Nisan, right? So we already had the opinion that the first of Tishrei, Rosh Hashana, when we measure the new calendar year has begun. One of the reasons for that, not just that it's a day of judgment, but that the world was created in Tishrei. Although the way I recall is that the first of Tishrei was actually the 6th day of creation when the humans appeared and could start counting the years. But at any rate, that the creation happened, that the birthday of the world is on Rosh Hashana, the first of Tishrei. Here we're learning that Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Elazar hold that the world was created in Nisan, the springtime month that contains Passover, and that the years are counted from that month as if the world were created in Tishrei, and the count started then. The first day of the first month of the 601st year in the story of Noah would already have been 6 months into the year for the purpose of counting years. And it is taught in a Baraisa that the sages of the Mishnah disagreed about this point. Rabbi Eliezer says, in Tishrei the world was created. In Tishrei, the patriarchs were born, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In Tishrei, the patriarchs died. On Passover, Isaac was born. On Rosh Hashana, Sarah, Rachel, and Hannah were remembered by God and conceived. And on Rosh Hashana, Joseph came out from prison and was elevated from a slave in prison to the second most powerful man in the world, the Grand Vizier for Pharaoh in the Joseph story. And that all happened on Rosh Hashana. On Rosh Hashana, our forefathers' slavery in Egypt ended. In Nisan, the Jewish people were redeemed from Egypt. And in Tishrei, in the future, the Jewish people will be redeemed in the final redemption with the coming of Moshiach. So according to Rabbi Eliezer, all these things happened on Rosh Hashana on the first of Tishrei, and the Messiah will come on Rosh Hashana. That's Rabbi Eliezer's opinion. Rabbi Yehoshua disagrees. And he says, in Nisan the world was created. In Nisan the patriarchs were born. In Nisan the patriarchs died. On Passover, Isaac was born. On Rosh Hashana, Sarah, Rachel, and Hannah were remembered by God and conceived. On Rosh Hashana, Joseph came out from prison. So everyone agrees about Joseph and Rosh Hashana. On Rosh Hashana, our forefathers' slavery in Egypt ended. In Nisan, the Jewish people were redeemed from Egypt. We know that because the Torah says it specifically. And in Nisan, the future of the Jewish people will be redeemed from the final redemption. That's why at our Passover Seder, right, we always open the door for Elijah, who will announce the coming of the great and awesome day of the Lord. When the Messiah will come, Elijah will announce him, right? And we think that that's going to, according to this opinion, it's going to happen around Passover time. So that's the opinion of Rabbi Yehoshua as opposed to the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. Skip down a little bit. So according to Rabbi Yehoshua, isn't it written fruit tree, indicating that the world was created in a season when the trees were already filled with their fruit, right? So like during the creation story, the trees were just brought out like filled with fruit. And the Gemara answers, that verse may be understood in accordance with the statement of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi. As Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi said, all the acts of creation were created with their full stature, immediately fit to bear fruit. They were created with their full mental capacities. You might have thought that during the 6 days of creation, God, planted seeds in the dirt. And, it took another month or year, or however long it took for the plants to start growing and many years for the trees to reach their full growth. But no, according to this opinion, when God said, let the earth bring forth plants and trees and fruits, etc., God can do it however God wants, and he just brought forth full trees. When they do this in a movie, it's like super accelerated growth, like time, it looks like time-lapse photography, but God grew the tree just instead of taking 20 years to grow a nice big tree, it happened, in 20 seconds. But not snap, and there's a full tree. According to this opinion, it was more like God said, let there be a tree, and snap, there was a full tree. So according to Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, it was, snap, and it's a full tree. They were created with, so all the acts of creation were created with their full stature, immediately fit to bear fruit. They were created with their full mental capacities in terms of the animals and the humans. They were created with their full form. Adam and Eve were not created as babies. They were created as adults with full ability to speak and reason like adults. As it is stated, and the heavens and the earth were finished and all their host. Do not read it as their host, tziva'am, rather read it as their form, tzivionam, which implies that the trees were created filled with ripe fruit. Since we got into this as a discussion of when, does a tree become a second or third year tree and its fruit becomes available for eating. Skip forward a little more. The Gemara asks, and according to the other Tana, Rabbi Eliezer, isn't it written in the month of Ziv? And the Gemara answers, Ziv is not an allusion to the patriarchs. Rather, it means that Nisan is the month in which there is radiance, Ziv, for the trees. As Rabbi Yehuda said, one who goes out during the days of Nisan and sees trees that are blossoming, recites, blessed are you, Lord God, ruler of the universe, who has withheld nothing from his world and has created in it beautiful creatures and beautiful trees for human beings to enjoy. And the Gemara continues, the one who said that in Nisan the patriarchs were born also holds that in Nisan they died. The one who says that in Tishrei they were born also holds that in Tishrei they died. As it is stated about Moses on the day of his death, and he said to them, I am 120 years old today. That's Deuteronomy 31:12. As there is no need for the verse to state today, since it is clear that Moses was speaking on that day, what is the meaning when the verse says today? It is to teach that Moses was speaking precisely, as if to say, today my days and years are exactly filled and completed. And this comes to teach you that the Holy One, blessed be He, sits and fills the years of the righteous from day to day and from month to month as it is stated, the number of your days I will fulfill. Exodus 23:26. Similarly, the patriarchs merited that their years be fulfilled to the day, and so they died on the date they were born. One who dies on his birthday, it usually means this was a tzaddik, a fully righteous person. We know that's the truth about Moses. He died on his 120th birthday, and according to this opinion, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob all also died on their birthdays because they were such righteous individuals. We're on the A side of page 11, by the way. So the law, with respect to this blessing that one says over the trees, if one goes out in the spring, which includes the months of Adar, Nisan, and Iyar. Adar, which has Purim in it, Nisan, that has Passover in it, Iyar, which is the next month, and sees fruit-bearing trees flowering. One thinks of the cherry trees that are flowering in Washington, for example. And he recites the following blessing. Blessed is he, blessed are you, Lord our God, who rule the universe, who has withheld nothing from his world and has created in it beautiful creatures and beautiful trees for human beings to enjoy. According to the Sephardic custom, the blessing is recited in a large congregation, and words of praise and thanksgiving are added. According to some authorities, the blessing is recited not only in Nisan, and rather in each place it is recited according to the flowering of the trees there. So there's a beautiful blessing that you can say when you see fruit trees flowering in the spring. We skip forward to the bottom of page 11a. It was taught in the Baraisa on Rosh Hashana, Joseph came out of prison. On Rosh Hashana, Joseph came out of prison. The Gemara asks, from where do we derive this? As it is written, Psalm 81, verse 4, sound the shofar at the new moon, at the covered time of our festival day, for this is a statute for Israel, a judgment of the God of Jacob. This is a reference to Rosh Hashana, as we discussed earlier. And the only festival that occurs at the time of the new moon, when the moon is covered and cannot be seen, is Rosh Hashana. And immediately afterwards, Psalm 81, verse 6, it is written, this he ordained in Joseph for testimony when he went out over the land of Egypt, implying that Joseph's release from prison took place on Rosh Hashana. That's your source for Joseph came out of prison on Rosh Hashana. Look to Psalm 81, verse 6. It was also taught in the Baraisa on Rosh Hashana, our forefathers' slavery in Egypt ceased. From where is this known? It is written here, and I will bring you out from under the burdens of Egypt, Exodus 6:6. And it is written there with regard to Joseph, I removed his shoulder from the burden. That's Psalm 81:7. From here it is derived by verbal analogy between the two instances of the word burden, that just as Joseph was released from prison in Tishrei, so too the slavery of our forefathers in Egypt ended in Tishrei. So according to this opinion, we know that the Jews came out of Egypt in Nisan, but according to this opinion, their slavery ended 6 months earlier in Tishrei. How is that possible? Wasn't, Moses continually negotiating with Pharaoh saying, let my people go? And they didn't finally leave until Nisan. So up until they left, weren't they enslaved? But the period of Moses going to Pharaoh and saying, "Let my people go." Okay, I'll let your people go. No, I won't let your people go. Okay, then I'm going to unleash a devastating plague on you and your land. There was like one plague per month. So it was a long, extended period when that was going on. And perhaps what's going on is that, by Tishrei, the Jews knew this was going to end and they stopped acting as slaves. They stopped listening to their masters. And it was only Pharaoh who was sort of clinging to the idea that this people would remain enslaved within Egypt. But according to that other opinion, the slavery ended in Nisan at the time of going out. Skip that. Okay, now on the B side of page 12, It was taught in the Baraisa, and the first of Tishrei is the new year for vows. And the sages taught in a Baraisa, one who is prohibited by a vow from deriving benefit from another for a year counts 12 months, right? So I can vow a vow and say, I will not benefit from this person. I won't take anything from him. I won't take money from him. I won't take gifts from him. In no way will I benefit from that person. Or he could say, I vow that Sal will not benefit from me. Now, this is a vow that needs to be upheld, and I will not be able to benefit from that person in any way, whether I vow or he vows. Now, when you take a vow, you could easily add a time limit to it and say, I will not benefit from him for a year. So then for 12 months, I don't benefit from him. But if I say, I will not benefit from him this year, then that's going to end on the first of Tishrei. And that's enough about that. And I'm almost done. So if you have any questions or comments, get them in now. This is the last bit that we're going to cover. It's on the A side of page 13. Rabbi Yirmiyah said to Rabbi Zera. Okay, so when we get into this idea, all right, so let me just go back. So vows and, right, the new year for vows is on the first of Tishrei. Okay. So the Gemara asks, but say that a year with regard to vows ends in Nisan. Why are you saying it's in Tishrei? Why not in Nisan? And the Gemara answers, the law is that with regard to vows, we follow the ordinary language of people, and the meaning of a vow is understood in accordance with the way the words are used in common speech. And when people speak of a year, they ordinarily count it from the beginning of Tishrei, when we celebrate Rosh Hashana. We learned in a Mishna there, Ma'asrot 1:3, from when is produce obligated in tithes, right? So when does produce become produce such that it will have to be tithed? This depends on the kind of produce we're talking about. Fenugreek is obligated from the time when it sprouts. Grain and olives are obligated from the time when they have reached 1/3 of their growth. Now think about that. So when they have reached 1/3 of their growth, okay, one has to tithe because the produce now exists. It's not ripe, but the fact that it has reached 1/3 of its growth means the produce is there, and then thenceforward we can call it grain or we can call it olives, and a tithe is going to have to be removed from it at the time of the harvest. But it is now obligated in the tithe once it reaches 1/3 of its growth. Top of page 13, A side, Rabbi Yirmiyah said to Rabbi Zera, and are the sages able to discern precisely between produce that reached 1/3 of its growth and produce that reached less than 1/3 of its growth? When has produce reached 1/3 of its growth? What kind of specific measurement is that? It seems like such a difficult thing to tell when the produce has reached 1/3 of its growth. How can the sages establish that as the dividing line between when one is obligated and one is not? Rabbi Zera said to him, do I not always tell you? So Rabbi Yirmiyah was a Babylonian who went up to Israel and studied with his teacher, Rabbi Zera. And Rabbi Zera said to him, do I not always tell you that you must not take yourself out of the bounds of the law, of the halacha? All the measures of the sages are like this. They are precise and they are exact. For example, one who immerses himself in a mikveh, in a ritual bath, containing 40 sa of water, that person is rendered pure. But if he immerses in a mikveh of 40 sa, a sa is a unit of volume, but in 40 sa, less the tiny amount of a kortov, which is just like a tiny bit of water, well, then he cannot immerse and become impure in that mikveh. It has to be 40 sa. If it's 40 sa minus a thimbleful of water, then it's not 40 sa, and immersing in that mikveh accomplishes nothing. Similarly, an egg bulk of impure food can render other food ritually impure, but an egg bulk less even the tiny amount of a sesame seed of volume does not render food ritually impure. You have to set standards. Says Rav Steinsaltz, Rabbi Zera's remark hints to Rabbi Yirmiyah's tendency to raise questions about borderline issues in halacha. He means to say that halachic measures in general, i.e. the set quantities required by halacha, such as the quantity of water required in a ritual bath, the measure for the impurity of foods, etc., are a tradition transmitted to Moses from Sinai and may not be questioned. The Ritva explains that in any case, clearly defined measures must be set, and so one may not raise objections from borderline issues. In other words, okay, it may not be easy to tell when grain has reached a third of its growth, but they needed to set a line somewhere, and they said 1/3 of its growth. The fact that it's difficult to tell doesn't mean that that's a bad measure. Accept it, Rabbi Yirmiyah. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. Let's go to your comments and questions. Sharon Frant Brooks, as a clinician who has worked with brain trauma and dementia for years, I always assume awareness of what is heard or stimulation. So Sharon is responding to what I said at the beginning about my mom and visiting her and her advanced dementia. And Sharon says, I speak, sing, and or touch any person with that belief. On the occasions when my head trauma patients have had some level of restoration of cognition, some say they do remember, most do not. But I also believe that on a deep level, they do. Thank you, Sharon. I really appreciate that, and I obviously share your belief. Lucy, so glad you are back. You were very much missed. Praying for your mother and your family. This is hard, but it is so good you could visit her. Thank you so much, Lucy. Lawrence, perhaps we are made to atone first, so we are better witnesses. I think you're talking, when I was talking earlier about Rosh Hashana being the day of judgment, right? And sort of, that the earthly court determines Rosh Hashana. This is Rosh Hashana. The heavenly court convenes to judge the people. But we have that month of Elul when we are getting ready for the day of judgment. And so we can start to take personal stock and get involved in the process of atonement. We don't want to wait until Yom Kippur to do our atoning. That's sort of like the end of the atonement process. I mean, it's actually something we do all year. And that's why the Al-Chet, the confession that we say on Yom Kippur, if you look in any Jewish prayer book, it's part of the daily prayers. Every morning we say the Al-Chet during the Tachanan, except on days when we don't recite Tachanan because it's a festival, a day of rejoicing. Shabbos, we don't say Tachanan. But on any normal day of the year, we are involved in the atonement process. And I 100% agree with you that taking personal stock in ourselves, atoning, acknowledging that we're fallible and that we have sinned, that we know we've sinned, that we explore our memories and our activities to see where we've sinned, makes us better witnesses and better judges. Yosef, I think we have at one time gone over the different opinions about the calendar among the sectarians. I've read that the community at the Dead Sea in the Second Temple era had an extra day or something like that. What were some of the differences between the Sadducees and others on this? That's a good question, Yosef. I don't know. The Tzaddukim, the Sadducees that did not hold by by the oral Torah, right? So they didn't hold by the authority of the rabbis to make interpretations and create ordinances to draw a fence around the Torah and come to protect us from violating, written laws in the Torah. They only held by the written Torah. They didn't hold by the tradition that certain laws were given to Moses orally at Mount Sinai and passed down through the generations. We've already talked about certain measures and certain laws that were given to, like for instance, what is tefillin was given to Moses orally at Mount Sinai. The Sadducees didn't hold by that. With regard to the calendar, it's very interesting. I mean, in terms of the Sanhedrin, that was composed of the rabbis. How did the Sadducees feel about that? How did they know when to celebrate Rosh Hashana? It's a great question. I'm just not prepared to give an answer. I'm sorry, but it's a good question. Sharon, King David also died on his birthday. Am I correct that it is on Shavuos, hence the reference in the book of Ruth? I know that King David died on Shabbos. Was Shabbos Shavuos that year? That sounds familiar. I just can't remember right now. It sounds right, but I'm not sure. But definitely King David died on Shabbos. That I remember. That he died on his birthday, I'm going to take your word for it. I don't remember that, but it sounds right. Sharon, but if they were no longer slaves in Tishrei, why matzah? Right, well, the bread of affliction and the fact that it was baked in a hurry. I don't think we hold by that opinion. I think we hold by the opinion that they went out of Egypt and went out of slavery in Nisan. Right? That seems to be the opinion that we hold by. This is just this other opinion, and then it's a good question. According to the one who says that they went out of slavery in Tishrei, but they didn't leave Egypt until Nisan, so what was going on during those 6 months? I was just speculating. I don't know what the answer would be from that point of view. Okay. Good questions. Good questions. If you find more than I've been able to share on these questions, put in the comments tomorrow night. Okay, my friends, that's what I've got for us today. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow night for Rosh Hashana, page 14. So now Shabbos is beginning and ending earlier and earlier. So hopefully I'll be able to get on the air even before 8 p.m. Pacific tomorrow night after Shabbos ends. And then when the calendar changes on the 7th of November, then it'll be much easier to do the Saturday night shows. May you have a sweet and healthy and uplifting and musical Shabbos. And may the soul of Rabbi Shlomo Carlebach have a great aliyah in the world of souls. We honor him today on his yahrzeit. And it's just amazing how so many of the Carlebach melodies have just, there's almost no synagogue in the world that isn't using some Carlebach melody somewhere in its davening. It's amazing that those melodies were only written, 50 years ago or less. And they just really penetrated the Jewish world. Good Shabbos.